There was a man by the name of Simmons, Mr. Simmons. Never knew what his first name. He lived in East Hampton here, and he lived along somewhere about where, I got to stop and think. Well, anyhow, along in where the Village Hardware is, in that area. But it was a house, of course, naturally they lived in those days. And I can remember that it had a fence out in the front that was made of galvanized pipe. A lot of people had pipe fences. And Simmons was the man's name. He had 2 sons, and they were not involved with it except later on. But he went down to that blacksmith shop, and he built 2 total, but he built a baseball table. And the first one that he built trial and error. He had nothing to go by. This was all in his head. And we were walking by there one day, and he called us in and wondered if we'd come in to give him a hand. And we went in, and he had this table set up. Now this table was like a ping pong table, and but he didn't have the whole thing. The outfield and so forth had was just a plain table, but the infield had all the works on it, and that's all he had was set up, was the infield part of it. And he wanted us to turn these cranks, each one of us, which was the man that hit the ball, ran first, by cranking this till you got him, because there's a peg stuck up through this thing, and that was the man running.
Yeah, in a slot.
Yeah, and there was a regular base down there, and that had a pin up like that, and the man going to first base, if that went over and say the third baseman got the ball and threw it across, if he hit the pin before the man got there, that was just like throwing it to first base, and the first baseman catching it, so itself. Or if he hit the man going, because that was just like touching him with a ball if he's running by you, you see. Everything that could be played on a baseball diamond was played on that table. And he kept experimenting with it, and it was very difficult to build something like that, because every action had to be timed, and it had to be possible to have that crank big enough, and there was a cable that ran underneath that table that was fast, and there was 4 of them. Yeah, had to be 4 bases, 3 bases, and home plays. There was 4 of them standing up there, and they all had to clear each other as they went. And they had a slot in that plywood-like, and I don't know what it was made of. I don't think it was plywood, but it was some board of some kind. But they all had to be timed whereby you could actually make a play if it was perfect. If it wasn't perfect, just like a baseball game of today. I mean, if the shortstop juggles a ball and has to pick it up twice, forget it. He's never going to catch the guy going for it. And that table was the same way. And all of this stuff had to be timed, you see. And that's what he wanted us for. And as I say, we would stop there, maybe, he'd call us in maybe every other night for 2 or 3 weeks while he was timing all this, because he was changing the size of the pulleys and the size of the crank handle. And he finally got it down where it was great. And Job Wood had that. Now, Job Wood had a store on School Street, right in front of a wood homestead. And this was before they had electric lights. And he had a gas pump out there that had a gas bowl up on the top of it that held 6 gallons. And in order to get gasoline, you had a lever down here, and you pumped this lever, and that would pump gasoline out of the tank up into that bowl. And it had rings around it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 gallons. And then you took the hose and you put it in your tank, and you opened the nozzle on the hose, and the gas ran down from gravity. That's where you got gas. And he had one of those pumps. But anyhow, this store that he had, and the only thing that he sold in there was, the Baker truck. Now, this is like continental bacon. I mean, this was a commercial truck. And he sold bread and rolls and various types of Danish and that kind of stuff. And of course, cigarettes and all that. And soda. And he had a freezer that they used, ice. What was that ice that they used to use? It was so cold, if you picked it up in your hand, it would freeze your hand before you could let it.
Dry ice?
Dry ice, yeah. And that was supplied, and he bought this ice cream, of course, off of an ice cream truck. But the people that sold the ice cream also supplied the dry ice to put in these freezers, which would keep the ice cream cold.
Yeah.
And it would last a long time. And that's the sort of thing. But he had a lot of floor space, and prior to getting that table, we used to go there and play pinochle on a table that he had in there, and there was this four-hand pinochle, and we just played for fun. I played in there a lot. And anyhow, this Mr. Simmons, I guess his name was, wanted to put this table somewhere and have people play on it, and his idea was, and it was a great idea, and today I'm sure that if you could have that, you could sell a lot of those to YMCA's or various clubs that are around, and there's so many of these recreation places and so forth, something like that would really go today. But he never, as far as I know, but I think I know he only built two, and I don't know, maybe he died, I really don't know why he only built two. But the first one that he built, as I say, he built, and Javwood had that in his store. And it took, let's see, two fielders, a pitcher, got started to think, there was one on each side of the table, so that would be, you had to get a combination. It took 5 men on a side to play. You had two fielders out in the stand out on the end of this table. You hit fly balls out there. They caught them and got home runs and anything. But there was one, and I always played, it would be third base and catcher. Now that was a combination. And on the other side was the first baseman on the other side. And then the pitcher was halfway down, and he was also had rules. He could balk, but they had at home place the batter. You did not change. You had one man bat until he made 3 outs. You didn't keep changing men because you had to get out of you sat in a chair there, and there was a lot of work to get in there and get set and so forth. So as I say, each man batted until there was 3 outs. And now this pitcher was he made it, and it looked like a man. It was spring-loaded, and it was out in the middle of the diamond, and it had he used a hard rubber ball about the size of a ping pong ball, yeah. But it was a hard rubber ball, and he had, for the hand, he made a circle like that, and this ball would set right in that circle. Now, you pull this pitcher guy back, his arm, and the whole thing came back. It was on a swivel, right? You pulled it back, and you cocked it, and it would stay there. And now it had a lever that held it there. And this lever came across to the outside of the table. Now, the man that was going to operate this, he would be the pitcher. He would stand outside of this table, but right even to where the pitcher was. And you'd put the ball in this thing, pull it back, and so forth. Now he's all ready to pitch. There was a lever that came across and had another lever on the outside, and that lever was level like that, and you pushed it down, that would release a cog that was in there, and this thing would go ahead, spring loaded, and throw the ball. All right, now, the pitcher had to have one hand on the table. That was just like a pitcher today that standing on the rubber and so forth and puts his hands together. He can't separate them unless he steps on the rubber. The pitcher could not take his hand off the side of the, and this was like a pool table, this part of it. It had sides on it, of course, across everything except in the outfield. There was no sides, but this other had sides, 4 inches high, maybe, or something like that. And it was flat on the top, very much like a pool table side. And anyhow, the pitcher had to put his hand down there like that. Once he put his hand down on there, then he was set. If he took his hand off without throwing the ball, it was a ball. So like that, and then depending on whether he was right, left-handed. I mean, but anyhow, we had one hand down there like that, and then this lever was over there, and you couldn't see this lever. The batter couldn't see it, so you didn't know when he was going to push it down, you see. And when he pushed that down, that would release this pitcher, and the pitcher would throw the ball. Now, the catcher, there was a double spring-like deal that came up, and it had leather on the inside of it, like the tongue on a shoe. And it was quite heavy, and that ball, if it went in there, that would catch it. So you had this, and that was stationary. That did not move or anything, but it would catch the ball. So this is the catcher. Now this is my job. I'm over to the third base side of the batter and the catcher, which is this mechanical gadget. And when the pitcher threw the ball, and it was timed to the point where it would, and this thing was only, to catch the ball, was only maybe that high, you know. It stuck up a ways, but the other part where it would catch the ball was 3 inches maybe, or something like that. And if you didn't hit that ball, it would stick in there. And now, my job was to, now I had a lever over on my side, and if it didn't catch it, then I pushed this lever down, and this another pin, right, that was in between this catcher's mitt, so to speak, it came, hit that ball, and put it back, drove it, threw it out to the pitcher. The pitcher had to catch that. As it went, it didn't go on a fly. I knocked it out like that, and it would bounce out there, or roll out there, and so forth. And in case there was man on first, and he decided to steal second, and the batter didn't hit the ball, and the ball stuck in there, I had to get the ball back quick enough so the pitcher could grab it and put the guy out going into second base, stealing. I mean, it was that much timed. I mean, it was perfect. And anyhow, now of course the batter sat right behind where this catching thing was, and he had a lever there that was spring-loaded, and that was in front of this catcher's mitt, so to speak, and that was very much like a, it would remind you of these rubber things that you clean jars out with. It was came up like that, and then they had a metal came off from it, which was the back, like a flag, and
So like a pinball machine.
Yeah,
now.
that's right,
Mhm.
yeah, it came up there, and that was right in behind this, well, not behind, but in front. Well, depends on which end you were sitting on.
Between the pitcher
Between
and
the
the catcher.
catcher and the pitcher, you see.
Yeah.
So if you missed it, then the catcher would catch it.
Yeah.
If you hit it, why, then it would go wherever you might hit it.
Yeah.
Now, the batter sat right in behind this thing, and he had a lever, and you turned this sideways and cocked it.
Yeah.
And it was, well, like you'd have a bat over your shoulder,
Yeah.
like that. It was back there. Now, the pitcher released the ball, you see the ball coming,
Mhm.
and the batter
Swing.
has got his lever there, you push this lever down, and this thing, oh, everything was spring-loaded like that. This thing would fly around, and if you was good at it, you could hit that ball. If you wasn't good at it, the ball go by it before your reaction could hit it.
Yeah.
And Elmer Wood, which is Job Wood's, well, Job Wood Senior's son and Job Wood Junior's father, because there was two Job Woods. But Elmer was the pitcher for the Springs team, and the only problem was it took 11 men, 11 people to play it. You see, you had about 5 on a side and an umpire, and it was hard to get 11 people together at one time to play a game. But we sometimes would play maybe with only 3 or 4 on the side, because that's all there was. And you'd have one outfielder. And then you would have a rule whereby if it went by the outfielder, there was only one base, maybe, instead of getting a home run if it was a full thing. That was a great thing. Now he built another one, and that one was up in East Hampton, and the second one he built was much larger. Everything was larger. The bat area was larger, the catching part was larger, it used a larger ball, the table was larger, it was further between the bases, but the handles and the pulleys was faster because they were going, well, not a greater distance, I guess. Couldn't have been, because it was all the same. But anyhow, and the pin stuck up was larger than the one that Job had. That was in where the Star Cleaner is today, right across from Buckets.
On Newtown Lane.
On Newtown Lane, yeah. And East Hampton had a team, and Springs had a team. And, Dick Steele, no, not Dick Steele, Dick Strong, Bill Ross. Anyhow, they had a 5-man team. And 2 of Simmons, Parker Simmons was one, the older brother. I don't remember what the younger brother's name was. But they played, and East Hampton had 5 men on their team. And they used to play a lot on this machine that was up there on Newtown Lane. And of course, we played on the one that was down at Job Wood store.
And when would that have been, approximately?
I was probably 16 years old, 1926.
Mid-20s.
Yeah, 1926, 27, long in there somewhere. And but we used to play the East Hampton team, and they played us, of course. You got to have 2 teams so you could play each other.
Yeah.
And we used to come up and play on this machine up here in Newtown Lane, and they used to come down and play down on the other machine down at Job Woods. But we played 22 innings and won. The Springs team won in 22 innings, 3-2. That'll give you how perfect it was to play baseball on that, to play that length of time with, and we were good at it by then. We played on it a lot. I mean, we were a team, and they were also, because they played on this one up here a lot. And you could do just about everything on there that you could do on a baseball diamond. And, oh, it was so much fun.
Yeah.
We had a lot of fun.
Huh.
And remember I asked John Wood what happened to it, and he couldn't
He couldn't
remember when he
remember.
was over to the ear doctor over there.
That's right.
He thought he gave it to somebody, he just couldn't remember whatever happened to it. But, and that was all built by this man down in Charlie Parsons' Blacksmith Shop.
Yeah, and he probably went down there because all the right equipment
Yeah.
was there.
Mm-hmm. But he had to buy, like the pulleys where the cables ran across.
Yeah.
But those pulleys had to be the right size to time it, you know. And those plays were just like they are. You might throw a man out running first by, the width of the ball. It'd be that close.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was fun. But he never sold. That was the only two, as far as I know, they was the only two that he ever made. And as I say, he thought of selling them. At that time, the big deal was YMCA's, you know, which was, of course, no men's clubs. And he was thinking about that would be a good deal.
Yeah.
And it might, like, there were pool halls. There may have been a sale in some pool hall, but it took some. You had to have an umpire. That was for the 11th man, you see. And so there's 5 on a side, which is 10 umpires. So it took a minimum of 11 players to play. And, oh, Charlie Parsons he was something special. He could do just about anything that anybody could do with iron, steel, or anything like that.
Blacksmith a few times. Who was the blacksmith back then?
Charlie Parsons. And he originally was down on Fireplace Road, as we called it, and he's right across the street from where Howard Quinn used to live. And Howard Quinn's house now is that museum for the artist, and what's his name?
Pollock.
Pollock.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Krasner.
You asked about the blacksmith shop. That was Charlie Parsons. He did impossible things. There was one thing, and to this day, I have no idea how he did it. We was up Green River, and we had a hand pump, and it froze up. And this was not like a pitcher pump. This was a bigger pump where it had a long shaft, and the valves and everything was down in a pit. And it froze up and cracked. Now the inner part of that was brass, had a brass cylinder in it. And the brass cylinder was put in a cast iron, another cylinder.
Yeah, like a casing.
Yeah, and the cast iron broke, and also the brass cylinder broke. Now, so they unhooked the pump and so forth. Snow was on the ground. I can remember they put it on a sled and gave me a note, but they told me to take it to Charlie Parsons. I don't know, 5 years old, 6 years old. I am not very old. And anyhow, see if he could repair that. And I did. They tied this thing, and this was fairly heavy, probably weighed, cast iron. It was probably weighed 50 pounds. And they put it on the sled and tied it on so that if it fell off, I would never be able to pick it up to put it back on again. They gave me a note and take it down to Charlie Parsons. I took it down there because there's snow on the ground this time. And he repaired it, but not right then. I left it and went back like the next day and got it, something like that. And now the only thing he had to work with was a forge. Now a forge is operated by bellows, which creates a draft, and you have it, and it's like they used to pump the old oh, in the churches, the
Organ.
organs, and the same thing, same. That was air, and he had air, and the air, and they used soft coal, and they always had a pit there, and the fire would be about this big, but when they put draft in it like that, it would come up through there, and this fire would come up like this and get real hot. That's the only thing he had to work with. Now, to this day, I don't know how he had two metals of different temperatures to work with, but he somehow or another repaired that brass one that was inside and the cast iron one that was on the outside, and we had that pump. As long as we lived up at Green River, we still had that pump. I took it back, and you'd say that was impossible. I mean, even today with modern welders and so forth, there's a lot of people that wouldn't be able to do that, but he did it.
Mm-hmm.
Now that cylinder's got to be right, because you got a plunger. Goes up and down there to suck this pump out. It can't be out of round.
Yeah.
It can't have rough spots on it. It's got to be smooth.
Yeah.
He did it, and I don't know how he did it, but he did. He did a lot of things, I'll tell you. Most all of the machinery that they had there, he built. And now we used to walk right by there when we went to work down at George Sid's at the farm, and we would stop in there occasionally. Or he might call us in, and he'd want a hand with something, to move something, or pick up something. And he'd see us walking by and say, "Hey guys, come on in for a minute. Need a hand."
Yeah. And that'd be you and Herb and
Horace and Cliff.
Horace and
Yeah.
Cliff.
Yeah, be four of us. Later on, Horace Miller bought a Model T Ford, new one, and then we rode because, and by this time, let's see, well, I was living down on Old Stone Highway when I quit school, so none of this happened when we were living on Green River Road, because I was too young for any of this. Although that pump deal, that was up on Green River.
Mm-hmm.
But when we were working down George City, of course, I was 14 up to 20,
Mm-hmm.
and as I say, we walked in the beginning, because nobody had a car, and then Horace got this Ford pickup, and he would stop, pick me up, and we rode then. But I used to take that team that I drove. He also shoed horses, shod horses, put shoes on horses, and that was quite a trick. He would take and get these horseshoes all came made in a factory, but they came in different sizes, like you'd buy shoes for your feet.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they might come, say 5 inches, 6, 5.5, 6, and so forth.
For different sizes.
Different size hoofs, different size shoes, metal shoes. But they were just horseshoes, period. There was no heels on them,
Yeah.
there's no cleat on the front. So he would take and determine what size shoe he's going to put on this horse. And he would take that blank shoe, so to speak, stick it in that forge, and then he would take another piece of metal that was about 1 inch long and the same thickness, width of that shoe that he was going to put on, and that becomes a cleat up on the front, and that was put on there so the horse's foot wouldn't slip with the steel.
Yeah.
And then also he made heels. He would take and bend the ends of this horseshoe over and come down. Now the cleat up on the front and the heel in the back was the same distance, so when the horse stood on it, he'd be standing level.
Yeah.
And after he did that, And he did all of that. Now he had to fuse that cleat that he put on the front, and the only way to do that, and he was the only guy that could do it. There was another guy worked there, did woodwork, and he made some hoops for me one day. Charlie Parsons happened to come in and looked at one, and I pulled it like that and pulled it right apart. And he said, that was a very good job, wasn't it? And he fixed it. That's another story. But anyhow, as I say, this was all done with those horseshoes being red hot. And then he would take the old shoe off of the horse, although the horse in a lot of cases may have lost its shoe, wore out and came off. And of course, you got it to the blacksmith as soon as you could, because a horse's hoof could get cracked, and then I don't know what would happen. It'd be a while before you could use that horse with a cracked. It was just like having your fingernail, same thing. But anyhow, and then he would take that after you got the old shoe off, and take a pair of long tongs to handle it with, pick the horse's foot up, and he would stand back too, so that the horse's foot came in behind him, put the horse's foot out here and have it between his knees like that. You take this hot metal shoe and put it on that horse's hoof and kind of burn it in. And didn't that stink? Oh yeah, stunk of high heaven. And smoke. I mean, you could see it. You could see the smoke coming up. It was that much. But it's amazing. I never knew a horse that ever object to that. I'm sure that some of them didn't like it, but I never saw one that didn't. But I didn't say he didn't like it. But and then that would be like, well, set my false teeth. The same idea. And then after you got that burned in, then he could see how much you might have to carve away, like you'd cut your fingernail. They had a special knife that they used, and he would still take that horse's hoof, and the horse's knee would be bent like that, and the hoof would be
facing up.
Yeah. And he would take that knife and go around, and he'd cut that excess hoof away on the outside. And then there was, I don't know what they did, a horse's hoof was like a horseshoe, but it had another spot in the center of it that was not hoof. It was, yeah, and occasionally they would cut something out of there, and I think that would be something perhaps like you would get a callus.
Exactly.
Yeah, and they would have to trim that off. And but occasionally a horse would step on a rock the right size, and that would get stuck in that horseshoe. And you didn't drive a horse very far with that, because it just wouldn't go, and you had to get that rock out of there. And in a lot of cases, it took quite a lot to pry it out, but you had to take it out. And oh, good old days. But he made a lot of things. Now, these spikes I was telling you about, if they used anchors to hold the spike in place, he made the anchor. Some people would use stakes. They would drive the stakes down, and these would only be big as a baseball bat, and they would drive them down. And then, instead of having an anchor on a rope, they would have a ring, maybe 6 inches across it, and that would be tied into the rope, and you'd take that and drop that over this stake. And he made those rings also. He would just take a plain, ordinary piece of round tubing, well, not tubing, but round steel, and make a ring with it, put the ends together like that, put in that forge and hammer it a few times. And he put something on there, I don't know what it was, kind of a powder-like deal.
To bind it.
Yeah,
build it.
to fuse, help fuse it. And it would burn, kinda like, powder. It was a different, color of, flame that would come off from it than the other. And I don't know what that would be, but he used to put that on there. I suppose that was kind of like soldering that you used to clean it or something, clean the metal, maybe, I don't know. But he made, they built wagons, farm wagons there. There was a man by the name of Edwards, can't think of his first name, don't make any difference anyhow. He would do the woodwork, build all the wagons, the spokes and the wheels and everything, and then Charlie Parsons did the metal work, because they all had to have tires, metal tires put around the wheels, and there was other metal that had to be, like on the fifth wheel, had to be metal, and a lot of the bolsters and so forth were made of metal in those days. So between them, they made it farm wagons. And all of that machinery was run by a steam engine. And you had the same as you got today. I mean, you had drills and anything that you wanted to turn, grindstones and all that kind of stuff. But it all ran by this steam engine. Now you had up overhead, and Holtz's Garage had the same thing. Up overhead, you have a couple of long shafts, and these shafts, every couple of feet or foot or whatever you wanted, would have a what's the word? Well, anyhow, where a belt went around.
A pulley.
Yeah, that's right. That's what it would be. And there was a belt that went around that, and then that belt came down to a workbench, and that ran a grindstone. Or it also ran a drill. And now this was not a drill that you put in your hand. That was one that stood up and so forth, and you to put the drill down, you had a lever here, and you put the work under there. But there was a pulley up here that was turned by that belt that came off of there, and that in turn turned a bit, and you pulled it down, and the drilled a hole. All of that stuff. And the way you shifted those belts from one to the other, they would have usually a wooden handle that came down from where that belt was up on that main shaft that was up there, and they could take that belt off of one pulley and slide it off to another. And as I say, maybe you was using a grindstone and they wanted to use something else that turned, like a lathe or something like that. And they take that same belt and put it on that other pulley, and then put it on the lathe there and turn the lathe. They were all, and they were leather belts, and you could go in there and they were noisy, really. All those belts would, in a lot of cases, they would slap together, you know, like that, when they were being used. But all of that stuff was built right there, put in. And that is the same blacksmith shop now that the Springs Historical Society has there by Asheville Hall. That's the same building, but it was moved up where it is. I've never been in that building. Someday I'm going to go down there and look in there and see what is in there. I don't know how much of the machinery was moved with it or what, but and they had a big anvil that would always set on a great big log. This tree log was standing on end, and that would bring this big anvil that they had up there, where it was handy to work on. And that anvil had a slot in it, and you could put like a cold chisel would set in there, and when they wanted to cut off a piece of steel, they would just take and put that steel rod or whatever it was on that cold chisel that was sticking up like that, and hit it with a hammer, cut it right off. They did great things. But then, and it seems like I'm always talking about Gil Miller, but we also had a Cletrac 20, which was a small tractor, a 4-cylinder, and the mosquitoes around here were so thick in those days that they'd eat you alive. I mean, nobody in their right mind, especially down around the meadows and so forth, ever thought of wearing a bathing suit. That was, I don't know if people in the springs really had bathing suits in those days. But anyhow.
You had green flies too.
Green flies, house flies, and mosquitoes.
Yeah.
And none of them was desirable, now I'll tell you. So when they got this federal money from the highway department, people decided that maybe it was a good idea to drain those meadows where the mosquitoes hatched and see if we couldn't eliminate some of those mosquitoes, which worked great. I mean, today we have very few mosquitoes, and this is 50 years later. But anyhow, what happened, well, as I say, now those meadows are, there's nothing under them. It's all roots and so forth. And horses, in a lot of cases, would go down to their bellies on there. And it looked good, but it wasn't. Anyhow, to get this tractor to go on there, we took the cleats off of the treads. And this tread was much narrower. The tread may have been 8 inches wide, maybe, or something like that, because this was a real small tractor compared to the one that I drove. Anyhow, Gil took and made long, about 2.5 feet, 2x3s out of oak, and bolted them on where those metal cleats went. Now, of course, it had to go just even with the tread in next to the motor, because it couldn't be any more, and the tread would go around because it hit something. But this thing stuck out there about 2 feet, and it looked so funny going down there. It kind of looked like it was a reaper of some kind or something. But that gave it barrenness. It gave it bearing enough on those meadows so that you could drive it on the meadow.
You distributed the weight over
a larger period. And then, now we got to figure out, I say, I had a little input in some of this stuff. Anyhow, decided that maybe the thing to do was to go down to Charlie Parsons and have him make a cutter, which he did. Now, this cutter would really, all it was a frame, and then it had 2 sides to it like that, and they were knives. And it was hollow in the front. It was just up on the top to hook onto and tow it. And it did have a place in the back where a man could steer it and also determine how deep it went and so forth. So Charlie Parsons made that. And it cut a trench about 1 foot wide and about 1 foot deep. And that's about how deep these roots was in this meadow that had accumulated over hundreds of years. And underneath that was nothing but mud. So and I say we, now I did not drive that tractor. Our Steele drove that tractor. But anyhow, and we had all those WPA workers. So you went along with the tractor, and way up in the meadows, you started in, and then you went right down to the creek, and you cut out that 1 foot wide and so forth. Now, the men came along with the spades, they called them, and they cut those bogs up into a square. And then they took a pitchfork and took them out and threw them out on the meadow. Well, somebody decided, well, we ought to get rid of those bogs because they're going to, at a high tide and so forth, it stands to reason they're gonna float.
Yeah.
And if they float and all the water is rushing out of this 1 foot deep and 1 foot wide trench, those boxes are going to clog it up.
Yeah.
So somebody got the bright idea of we'll take those down to the Narrows. Now the Narrows was down on the beach, which is Gerard Park today,
Yeah.
and there was a road went, but it was all beach sand and was not a hard road or anything. So he thought that would be a great idea to take those foot square cube bogs down there, lay them down there like blocks, like the cobblestones they used to put in New York and so forth, and that make a great road bed. Well, it worked fine, and it was a good road bed. Except when we got a storm and the water came across that low area there, they ended up in Bonnet Creek. So all of the work of putting those things down there didn't amount to much. And then after that, what we did, then we built a bulkhead down there. And today, you go down there and there's big chunks of concrete there, rocks and so forth, where that bulkhead was. But we did build that bulkhead, but building the roads out of that bulkhead, and that was like peat. It was the same thing, as I understand it, over in Ireland and so forth. They burned peat. And that's what this really was when it got dried out. Very much the same thing. So, now, I have not said anything about working on the water, which I did. There were three classes of people really down in the Springs. The wealthier ones, which lived down in Fireplace, never worked on the water. They were strictly farmers. They had maybe 100 acres of land and so forth, and they could make a living on the farm and other things. That's where I worked for George Sid. Those people would go and we'd get a mess of clams, and that was about all. Most of them never even had a rowboat. Now, there was another class of people that did both. My great uncle, which lived across the street from us, Uncle Charles, he was a farmer in the summertime and a fisherman in the wintertime, and also in the spring he had tracks, a fish track. And then there was other people that made a living on the water and really never worked on the land, like farming or anything like that. They might have a small garden for their own use. Other than that, they had no farming. So you really had three classes of people down there. And what they did to start with, the wealthier ones and had the facilities were, as an example, go down to Montauk, and people down to Montauk set those traps out into the ocean. And they got a better grade and much more bass that came along the shore, and all of those big fish that used to come along, which never got into the bays. And so they were pounds, they called them. And there was, 3 or 4 family down to Montauk that did that. There was the Parsonses and the Duriers and Jake Wells. I knew Jake Wells, for the matter of fact. We sold him a Hudson. But he also had a little country store like down there. So you had that class of people, and then you come up to Springs and Amagansett, and you had, in Amagansett, you had the Hoses, they called them, which was a family of Lesters that had done that for years. They used to go off into the ocean in dories, which is really a rowboat sort of thing, and they set seines, they called them. And they would go out, they'd leave one end of the seine, and this seine would be a half mile long or longer. They'd leave one end fast to the beach. They would go out with a boat and let the seine go out, and they would go out and then make a U-turn and come back again, which would be just like a horseshoe. And then they would take both ends of that seine and pull it in, and whatever that horseshoe part of the seine caught and fish, that's what they got. So they were the seiners, they called them. And now you get down to where I was born, and down in Bonnet, Butcher Springs. There were several things that they did down there. They were eel pots, which naturally caught eels, and they were set in Atlantic Harbor. And there would be 3 or 4 people that would have eel pots, and they would have 30 or 40 of those, and they were homemade, and they were about a foot square and 2.5 feet long, and they were made out of what today would be called rat wire, and they baited them with sand eels, which they called them, which was a little eel-like fish, but it was only about 3-4 inches long. And then they had silverside, which was a little bit bigger, and the reason they were silverside, you would see millions of them. And for some reason or another, they would all turn at once. They just like they were all fast together. And when they turned, if the sun shone on them, they looked like silver. They would reflect like a reflector, and that's how they come to be silverside. And they were about the size of a sardine. And they used to be schools of those things. They would catch them in cheesecloth and catch them. The sand eels, somebody must have eaten those things, because they used to catch them and ship them into New York. And whoever eat them, I have no idea. But
You wouldn't have eaten them.
I wouldn't like them. But somebody bought them. I don't know what they did for them. Maybe they used them for manure and flower pots or something. But well, anyhow, that was what they baited the eel pots with when they could get them. If they couldn't get those, and it was in scallop season, when they opened scallops, they would take the inwards of the scallop. The only part of the scallop that was saved was the muscle, which we call the eye, and that was edible. The rest of it was thrown away, which really was the inwards, and the gut, we called it. And they used to save that and put it in a separate pail and use that to bait eel pots. So you had the people that set eel pots, and now you couldn't get eels year round, because eels goes in the mud when you get cold weather. The eels hibernate, but they hibernate under the water. So these eel potters could only do it maybe 6 or 7 months out of the year. And then you had another thing that they did down there, and I went with my father, and they were my grandfather's fikes, they called them, and they were set in Accabonac Creek, and they caught a variety of fish, small snappers like, which are small bluefish, but they were bigger than normally. They would be pound and a half maybe, and the snapper would only go a half a pound, but they were baby bluefish. But the big deal was perch. And as I say, I can remember being 5 or 6 years old and go down with my father, and he would lift these fikes, as they call them, and maybe get 3 boxes of fish, and each box would hold about 100 pounds.
And you were right in Accabonac Harbor?
Right in Accabonac Harbor itself.
What
yeah.
section of the harbor were you in?
Well, they set them all over, but they were like everything else, depending on the bottom. Fish is like animals and anything else. They go where the feed is. and over time, you know what they live on, and that's where they are, and that's where you set these traps and so forth.
So you
None of-
didn't always go to the same spot?
Not necessarily, but usually, if you could catch them in one place this year, they would be again next year.
And what spot did you go to?
In Acquabonic Harbor,
Yeah.
well, off Zeekels Hill, all of those places around Acquabonic Harbor had names.
Mhm.
They were Landing Lane, which is the nearest one to where we lived, and that's where we went down and kept our boats, and rowboats I'm talking about now. And then there was another one that was called the Shipyard, and that was over, and that's the one that I described earlier about getting ice for the ice house and so forth. And that was over that really up ahead of the harbor, further into the harbor than Landing Lane. Then there was another one that was over which they called East Harbor, and that was off Louse Point, and that was one. And then there was another one down at the Narrows. So in reality, Bonnet Creek had like 4 fingers, and each one of these fingers went off, as I say, and that was called good ground down where the Narrows was. And then the one over up by the store for a Shipyard, and that's what they call it. That was Shipyard.
Mhm.
And then the other one was Landing Lane, and that was the name. If anybody told you they went to Landing Lane, and you know where they went. And the other one over there at East Harbor was the same way.
And wasn't there one called High Spot?
Called what?
High Spot?
High Spot?
Yeah.
High Ground.
High Ground?
High Ground. Yeah, well, that would be Zeekels Hill.
Oh, okay.
Now, Zeekels Hill it's a little hill, but it's only maybe 20 feet higher above the water and so forth. And that was in between Shipyard and Landing Lane.
Mhm.
And that's where I used to go. One summer there was, more scallops than you could possibly catch. And I went there, and I don't know when this was. I know I was married, and went probably after work in September. The license, the law went off in September, and I'm fairly sure that I may have gone after I got through working with the town, and then Saturdays and Sundays, Saturday afternoon. And anyhow, you couldn't pick them up because you couldn't see it. It was all full of grass and mud and so forth, and it had to have what they call dredges. And the blacksmith made those. And they were iron frames, and they had sort of a knife-like deal that scraped along the ground, and they were had a net on the back of them, and they would keep these scallops up, and they'd go over, roll over like that, and go into this net. And then when you pick the scallops up, it was like picking up a bag out of the dredge. It was like picking up a bag.
Mhm.
And then you had a cull board, they called it, and this would be several boards fast together, and there would be no end in it, but there would be sides, and it would be up maybe 3 or 4 inches. And you'd take these dredges, you pulled it up, you'd dump it on this cull board, and that dumped everything that was there. And of course, you got everything. You got empty shells, and you got anything that was there, you got it. And all you wanted was a scallop. So what you did on this cull board, you started on one side of it, and you started poking it off, and as you come to a scallop, you picked it out and put it down in your basket or whatever you're going to do, and threw this stuff otherwise,
Yeah.
overboard.
Mhm.
And it worked, I mean, but it was stupid. For years and years and years, you could only catch scallops by hand lining. Now, hand lining meant that you would have 100 or 200 or 300 feet of rope. And you would have a heavy anchor, which we called a pike anchor, And that's what they fastened these spikes with that I was telling you about my father. And they also used poles. They used both. But these spike anchors were quite a big anchor, and they were solid enough so you put them over, and you could take two drudges, one on each side of your boat. The anchor would hold enough to pull the drudges. If the anchor slipped, the drudge would stay there and the anchor would come to you. Well, that wasn't desirable. But it was so stupid, especially after they put a 5 bushel limit. You could only catch 5 bushel scallops anyhow, and these boats could sail. I mean, you could make them sail in a place like that, or in Three Mile Harbor. Why did you have to pull on this line? That's what the pull line. That's what it was. You pull it hand over hand over hand, and it didn't go that easy. I mean, you're pulling the boat and two dredges, and anyhow, that was scalloping. And as I say, the ones that had eel pots, and also they used that for lobsters, but not to that extent. Most of that was fish and for lobsters. So you had eel potters, and you had people that set fikes, and then you had clammers and scallopers, and there were two kinds of clam. There were the long clam, as they called them, and most of them had white shells, and they were long, and they were used primarily for making clam pie. They also used those as bait when they went off. There was another thing that went out in the ocean that I didn't mention. In the wintertime, they would go out there what they call trawls. Now, a trawl is a long line that maybe has, well, it depends on how long the line is, but it could have 500 hooks on it. And these hooks would be hanging down. Now, you're trying to get fish that are up to the top. Fish, flatfish is way down, bass and so forth is up. And all of these fish have different areas depending on the food that they're after. But anyhow, they were after, can't think of the name of it, but I will think of it pretty soon, out in the ocean. And there were several crews of that. And there was one right down there, the Hulses, down at Pots and Kittles, down there. Wybogs Beach, it's known as today, down on the ocean. But anyhow, they would go out in the ocean, and they would go out off a ways, and they would put down an anchor that this trawl was fast to. And this trawl would have a buoy on it, so they'd know where the anchor is. So this buoy, they would go out there and find this buoy. When they got ready to pick it up, find this buoy and pull up the anchor. But anyhow, they went right straight off the beach. And depending on how long those lines was, as to how far they went, but they would have a hook every, 5 or 6 feet. Mm-hmm. And that hook would be on a line, and it would be down maybe 2 feet. Now, this trawl line had corks on it, and that would float. Mm-hmm. So you got a long line out there that is on top of the water floating, and down a couple of feet or so you have hooks down there that are baited with clams or skimmers, as we used to call them, and they were a gold colored, similar to a long clam, but they were gold colored, and the meat was gold colored. Most people never thought they could eat those, but later on they found that they could. But anyhow, this is what they baited, and they went, codfish is what they were after. And that was in the wintertime, as I say.
And
so
that's in the ocean you're talking
that was in the
about.
ocean. That was another one that they did along with the big fish traps that they had out in the ocean. And they did very much the same thing. You see, a trap would have a big box like out there that was the main, that's where they caught the fish. And then it had a leader that went from the shore out to that trap. And then it had what they call wings that came back, and in theory, and that's what happened. A fish coming along next to the coast or next to the land would come, and they'd hit this leader. They couldn't get through it, so they would try to go around it, and they'd go out like that. And then they came to a V, and because this leader came back, a wing came back off the leader, and you got a V there. Now there's opening in there, and they find this opening, so they decide, oh, this is the way to keep going. Well, then they're in a trap, and then they can't find a way out because they're too stupid to find that V-shaped opening is in there. So they were also set in Gardiner's Bay. Now the ones that set those in Gardiner's Bay were, to my knowledge, there was only 3, I guess, that set traps in Gardiner's Bay, and that was Edwards Brothers, which I told about, Merton and Irving Edwards, and they did it in Gardiner's Bay. They did not have the facilities to go out in the ocean. They didn't have boats big enough, and
Well, and they were closer to the bay.
and they were
lived
closer. That's right, yeah. And
Who were the other ones that had?
and they was George George Bennett, and his son Augustus Bennett. They were over, and they set traps, and it almost George. There were so many George Bennetts and so forth. You had to give them nicknames. And this particular George Bennett they call Button Eye. And then there was another one over there which also set traps, but I think he only had, and that was Philip Miller. That would be Roy Miller's father. I think he had 1 trap. And by the way, you had to get permission and a license to set those traps because they were considered a hazard to boating. And also, on the end of those traps, you had to have a lantern. And in those days, there were kerosene lantern, but they would fill this lantern with kerosene and a regular wick and go up there and hang this lantern on the end of this trap so that people coming along with a motorboat after dark, there wasn't any lighthouse or anything, but this, if they saw this lantern out there, they wouldn't know enough to go around on the outside of that lantern and not get tangled up in the guy's net.
How long would the lantern burn?
I don't know, maybe a couple of days.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because it would hold a quart, maybe or more. And maybe those lanterns were bigger than what they used to carry. I really don't know. But I know they put the lanterns on them. And they may have had a bigger oil capacity than the lanterns that they used to carry around, like you carry a flashlight today. People used to walk around with lanterns.
Did you tell me that they had to put their traps in a particular location?
That's right.
That was part
You
of
had permission to put your trap in a certain place.
Yeah.
And you kept that. Nobody else could put a trap in there as long as you held that permit, license, or whatever you want to call it. And so everybody had their own location that they put these traps. And in Gardiner's Bay, from Promised Land around to 3 Mile Harbor, there might have been 10, maybe. And that's quite a long ways, and they would be half a mile apart at least. So that was what. And then there was another couple of things that they did in the bay. They went out and they had a set net. Now a set net is just about the same as the trawl that they went off with the ocean with it, except this is set in the bay, and this baited, and they catch a different small fish. As a rule, the ocean had the bigger fish, bays had the next bigger fish, and then the next smaller fish, and then the creeks had the little ones.
Yeah.
And so anyhow, these set nets, runarounds, they had They had several names, but really what it was just a net was out there, and there were two types. There was one that was baited with hooks. Then there was another one that had the mesh of the twine was a certain size, and that was usually set in a straight line, and these fish that